Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon, everybody. Today's hearing addresses a very important humanitarian crisis to more than 50 million children orphaned on the continent of Africa. Indeed, to put this in perspective, as one of our witnesses today, Chimwei Montemva, has pointed out, with such a number, the orphans of Africa, if grouped together in a single country, would be the fourth largest country in all of Africa, after Nigeria, Ethiopia, Democratic Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The factors contributing to this crisis are varied, starting with civil war and civil unrest, which have displaced millions, wars that have led to the deaths of parents and other adult relatives, leaving children to fend for themselves, or sometimes children who are separated from their parents in a mad flight for sanctuary, never learning if their moms or dads are alive or dead. They may never know if they are orphaned in reality or if both parents turn out to have survived and are alive in a refugee camp somewhere else. Such parents, too, agonize over whatever happened to their beloved children. Our children, other children, are indirect victims of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which has wreaked such devastating havoc on the continent, or other diseases. They could have lost one or both parents to this or some other dreaded diseases, often being forced into the role of primary caretaker of younger siblings. Their childhood innocence is ended by the burdens of adult responsibility. As with many of the humanitarian crises that confront the continent, there is a big picture aspect to this one, and one which we as Congress certainly need to address. There are important strategic implications of so many children and adolescents left without moms or dads. We have all heard of the scourge of child soldiers, how orphan children are recruited and brutalized themselves into becoming remorseless killers. Terrorist groups such as the Lord's Resistance Army, under the rapturous warlord Joseph Kony, actively recruit child soldiers. Perhaps our State Department witness, Robert Jackson, the Honorable, with his vast depth of regional knowledge, may address that in his remarks today. And if humanitarian reasons are not enough to compel Congress to rally behind the efforts to address the issue of Africa's orphans by USAID and countless other charitable organizations, many of them faith-based, then strategic concerns and the effect that this has on the stability throughout the region should be a reason to sit up and take notice of this tragedy. But behind every statistic about an orphan child or children, behind the pie charts and graphs, there is also a portrait in miniature, a lonely child who is left without a mother or a father, perhaps dealing each night with the pangs of hunger, or just seeking a place where he or she can lay down their head in safety until the morning comes. That child awakes to forage and to fend for another day. Behind every statistic, there is a young boy or girl who has to deal with the sense of abandonment or with the trauma of having seen parents killed before his or her own eyes. There is a little soul, a young person whose inherent dignity has been scarred in a world itself wounded, where there is so much pain, suffering, and darkness. These children are in need of love and compassion, of simple needs being met. Those who find loving homes and families are truly the lucky ones. One remedy for this crisis is intercountry adoption, which sometimes brings children from Africa to our shores to provide them with loving homes. This is, of course, only a partial remedy, because for every child who is given a loving home, there are many more for whom there will never be such a refuge. At best, they may end up in an institutional orphanage, which is a topic fraught with controversy. While the best ones, again, often faith-based, help address the developmental and education needs of children, the worst may abet human trafficking. In some cases, such institutions do not even shelter orphans per se, but rather children are placed there by parents who think that their children will get a better education and nutrition than what they themselves can provide. Clearly, such institutions can never provide the type of love that a father and a mother, along with any siblings, can provide. One issue that will be addressed in our second panel today, then, is the role of intercountry adoption in helping address, or at least in part, the crisis of orphans. Some of the testimony will be critical to the role of our State Department's Office on Children's Issues in the Bureau of Consular Affairs. Such testimony needs to be heard, for we can and we must, all of us, do better. We will also hear about an adoption issue that has received a lot of attention on Capitol Hill, and was the topic of a resolution authored by my good friend and colleague, Colin Peterson of Minnesota, which I'm happy to say was passed by the House of Representatives just a few weeks ago, after being marked up by our committee and then the full Foreign Affairs Committee. Last year, the DRC suspended the issuance of exit permits for Congolese children adopted by foreign parents, impacting hundreds of U.S. families. The suspension means that the Congolese children adopted by American parents simply cannot leave the country to go to their new homes, even though the parents have been officially declared the legal guardians under Congolese law. What's more, despite the exit permit suspension, Congolese courts have continued processing new adoptions, leading to a backlog of adopted children who are unable to leave the country. More than 800 American families are caught up in varying degrees of this adoption limbo, breaking hearts. This is a deplorable situation for these children and for their distraught families as well. Indeed, we will hear about this from one such family that has been impacted, as well as an advocate for families that, in like manner, have been impacted. Finally, I also want to say a word to those parents here today who have endured not only burdens that are financial, but ones that are primarily emotional, separated from the children they have voluntarily and lovingly welcomed into their lives. Your hardship and pain is deeply noted by my colleagues and I, as well as our staff members, many of whom have worked not only on passing Congressman Peterson's resolution, but have also promoted within our State Department and the government of the DRC some effective and durable remedies to these situations. Please continue to persevere. Don't give up hope. Both the executive branch and the legislative branch are firmly in your corner. I'd like to now yield to Karen Bass, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, as always, for your leadership on this and so many other issues. I'd also like to thank our distinguished witnesses, including the Honorable Robert Jackson, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of African Affairs, the Honorable Lancy Lindbergh, Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, and humanitarian and advocacy experts from the civil society. According to UNICEF in 2012, there were an estimated 56 million orphan children in Africa, of whom an estimated 27% were orphaned due to HIV/AIDS. Numerous sources suggest orphans typically consist of a number of our most vulnerable children who have been or could become victims of trafficking, child labor, violence, and abuse. We can't allow children under any circumstances to be subject to such brutality. Congress should do all we can to ensure that all children can grow up in loving and caring homes. I am a proud co-sponsor of Children and Families First, which is led by my esteemed colleague, Senator Landrieu, and Representative Smith, correct? This legislation can be one of the solutions to addressing the issue of orphan children, not only in Africa, but around the world. SHIFT, as we are calling it, Children and Families First, aims to redirect some of U.S. resources to focus more on ensuring that all children grow up in families, draws on the strength of agencies to achieve that goal. As we prepare to hear from today's witnesses, I hope we can learn lessons from their expertise and use their knowledge to improve conditions for orphan children in Africa. I'm committed to working toward this end and look forward to working with my colleagues to find the most effective and sustainable solutions.
Thank you very much. Because of time limitation, did you want to just very briefly, if you would?
Yeah, just very quick, want to thank the chairman and ranking member for obviously a very important hearing. We've still got a long ways to go, though, so thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barr. As John Lennon said in the Ballad of John and Yoko Ono, it's good to have both of you back. We have two very distinguished government leaders providing testimony, and without objection, your full resumes will be made a part of the record, but very briefly. Nancy Lindbergh is the Assistant Administrator of the Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Affairs at USAID. She has testified before our committee on numerous occasions. Since assuming her office in 2010, Ms. Lindbergh has led DCHA teams in response to the ongoing Syria crisis, the Horn of Africa in 2011, Sahel in 2012 droughts, the Arab Spring, the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and numerous other global crises. Prior to joining USAID, she was president of Mercy Corps, where she spent 14 years doing that wonderful work of protecting the weak and the vulnerable. We will also then hear from the Honorable Ambassador Robert Jackson, who is currently Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of African Affairs. He previously served as Ambassador to Cameroon, as well as Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge at the U.S. embassies in Morocco and Senegal. He has also served at U.S. embassies in Burundi, Zimbabwe, Portugal, and Canada. At the State Department headquarters, he has worked in commercial and consular sections and conducted officer training. He's also performed oversight work in the Office for the Promotion of Democracy and Human Rights after 9/11. Ambassador Jackson has appeared before this subcommittee, again, on many, many occasions, and welcome back. I think, Ms. Limborg, you needed to go first.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for inviting me to testify today. And Chairman Smith, I want to specifically acknowledge your extraordinary leadership on human rights and humanitarian assistance worldwide. So many thanks. Africa, as we know, is a continent on the rise. It has growing economies and the youngest population in the world. 50% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa is under the age of 18. So there's an extraordinary potential for this generation of youth to shape the future in powerful ways. However, more than 200 million of these children currently live in extreme poverty. Over 15 million children have lost one or more parents to AIDS, and millions more, as we've heard, are affected by conflict and natural disaster. I've personally seen what happens to children and families who are affected by these conflicts. Often the shocks are coming one after another. And we also have seen the enormous difference that USAID-supported programs can make in the lives of these affected. I want to just cite Nuala Rauch, who a 29-year-old mother in Bor, Sudan, and during the recent violence, she saw conflict coming towards her house. She tied her two young sons together so she wouldn't lose them, but they nonetheless got swept away in the crowds. And it was through a U.S.-supported center that reunited families that she was able to find her sons again. In the middle of a conflict, that's a powerful and important thing to have happen. The United States has long been the largest donor for orphans and vulnerable children. And in 2005, a very important law, Public Law 109/95, passed that coupled with the learnings from an evidence summit in 2011 really helped us to galvanize across the entire interagency and prompt us to create an action plan on children and adversity. And so for the first time, we now have across the interagency a common framework and a shared language that really pulls together the efforts of 7 agencies across the U.S. government. And as you noted, Chairman Smith, there are many causes of adversity, from conflict to poverty to HIV/AIDS, but this framework helps us understand and stay focused on the 3 overarching interrelated objectives that we know are the most important for making a difference in the life of a child. So I want to just quickly talk about those 3 objectives. The first is, Africa has seen extraordinary progress in reducing the number of children who die before their 5th birthday. These mortality rates have been reduced by almost half in 20 years. We stand within reach of ending preventable child and maternal deaths by 2035. That's extraordinary. We also know that keeping children alive is also just the first step. We know that the first 1,000 days between a woman's pregnancy and a child's 2nd birthday lays the foundation for your entire life, for your lifelong health and your future development. So the first objective of our action plan is to build strong beginnings. And we're helping to build the long-term health of children through nutrition, through health. We have a new USAID nutrition policy, and our Office of Food for Peace is applying the best of nutritional science to reformulate special foods that meet the nutritional needs of children under 2 with more therapeutic food products. We've also seen the increasing evidence of the essential need for nurture and emotional support during these early critical formative years. And studies have shown that excessive stress can actually have the same effect on a developing brain as malnutrition. A very powerful story that has informed this was that following the genocide in Rwanda, when 1 million refugees poured into what was then Zaire, in an effort to save lives, infants and children were separated from their families and essentially laid out on beds so they could receive vaccines and IV nutritional feeding. Yet they still died by the hundreds. And what we learned from that was the phenomena called failure to thrive, that they lacked the human contact and nurture that is required to grow and to develop. This is a very painful and powerful lesson, but that's led to our second objective of the action plan, which is called Put Families First. Evidence has shown that families, extended families, including parents, grandparents, relatives, foster or adoptive families, are the best source of support for children. Yet we know that about 46 million children in Africa have lost one parent and over 10 million have lost both. The vast majority outside of family care do have parents and relatives, and there's a rich tradition of kinship care in Africa. So getting children into families and strengthening the ability of those families to care and protect is a significant, critical priority in both our humanitarian and development programming. And to do so, our programs support families struggling to provide care for vulnerable children by connecting them with a range of help options, whether it's urgent material needs, financial needs, long-term family income generation, or access to health and treatment services. We aim to empower them to decide what is best for their families so they can care for their children. The third objective of the Action Plan on Children in Adversity is to protect children, particularly at an early age. Across the continent, we're targeting vulnerable children, including, as you've noted, child soldiers, street children, children accused of witchcraft, children lost in the legal system, children with disabilities, child laborers, and HIV/AIDS orphans. A goal is to support children's reintegration into communities to help children and youth get the kind of life and vocational skills that can set them on a pathway, strengthen local groups in their ability to contribute to advocating for children's rights in their communities. We focus on providing safe spaces for children to heal, to learn, give parents and other caregivers time to address their own needs and those of their families. So this includes outreach, direct support for parents, and really tries to decrease the risk of family separation or child labor. Very importantly, we also focus on strengthening country systems. This is a key component of success as we help local and national governments take a critical, more active role in supporting their own children. We know that if we don't focus on the child, we lose the person. And we know that investments in a strong start for Africa's children are absolutely critical to lay a foundation for a healthy, productive future for Africa itself. So USAID remains very committed to meeting the needs of vulnerable children in Africa while also reducing the root issues that create those conditions for conflict and abuse. We very much look forward to continuing the cooperation of the work across the U.S. government, and especially with this subcommittee, in our shared commitment to promote healthy, resilient families and communities where children can thrive. Thank you.
Ms. Limborg, thank you very much for your testimony. Ambassador Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to testify on the Department of State's response to orphaned and vulnerable children in Africa. This hearing is very timely, coming just weeks before the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit on investing in the next generation. The Department of State is committed to supporting children in adversity around the world, including orphaned and vulnerable children. This work is accomplished through the Department's diverse programmatic activities, diplomatic engagement, and policy development. We engage the expertise and capacity of multiple department offices and bureaus. At the outset, I wish to make clear that the State Department does not isolate African orphans in its advocacy for children in adversity, nor does the Department relegate its concern only to Africa. All regional bureaus, many functional bureaus, and the leadership of the Department are focused on this. It is a very high priority. And we closely coordinate this work with USAID and other U.S. government agencies. Allow me to focus on some of the most prominent issues facing children in Africa, including AIDS, trafficking, and conflict, and how we are working in the Department and with our colleagues at USAID to help address these issues. It is estimated that there are 17.8 million children who have lost one or both parents due to AIDS, and 90% of them live in sub-Saharan Africa. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief is addressing the needs of orphans and vulnerable children through programs that mitigate the social, emotional, and economic impacts of HIV/AIDS on children and reduce their risk and vulnerability while increasing their resilience. These programs have kept children in school, maintained children in supportive family environments, kept children safe by working with governments to promote child welfare system strengthening, including the prevention of child abuse, gender-based violence, and social protection, and reduced barriers to HIV and health and nutrition services, to name a few. Over the last 4 years, more than 5 million children worldwide have been supported by PEPFAR's Orphans and Vulnerable Children programs. Second, conflicts in Africa, including those in the Central African Republic, Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda, which you mentioned, have provoked an increase in the number of children recruited or used as child soldiers. We take very seriously the issue of unlawful recruitment and use of children as soldiers in government or government-supported armed groups, as the Department is responsible for producing a list of these governments as mandated by the Child Soldier Prevention Act, CSPA. In accordance with that act, we continue to work with African governments to address child soldiers in their countries, encouraging the signing and implementation of joint action plans with the UN Special Representative, the Secretary General, for Children and Armed Conflict. We also support the work undertaken by UNICEF to demobilize, disarm, and rehabilitate former child soldiers. This year alone, UNICEF has secured the release of 1,000 child soldiers in the Central African Republic. We have seen that these action plans can be effective. The actions taken by the government of Chad to remove children from the armed forces ranks were so successful that a verification mission undertaken by UNICEF found no child soldiers at all, and Chad was not listed this year on the CSPA list or the annual report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. I have also seen firsthand how engaging with former child soldiers can make a difference. When I visited Liberia with Deputy Secretary of State Higginbottom in June, we met former child soldiers who had formed non-governmental organizations and had created small businesses to help themselves and others reintegrate into society. One of these stressed the importance of healing, behavioral change, and economic opportunities, which underscored to me how cross-cutting this issue is. Grassroots African efforts like this, people helping people, need to be encouraged and supported. Third, we know children can be vulnerable to international and domestic human trafficking, whether through sex trafficking, forced child soldiering, or forced labor. AIDS orphans, including those from Swaziland and Lesotho, are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Children throughout the continent are exploited in domestic servitude, forced begging, and forced labor in a variety of sectors, including mining, fishing, cattle herding, and harvesting coffee, cocoa, and rice. Armed conflict and other instability, poor economic conditions, food insecurity, rural poverty, and lack of social safety nets can also leave children vulnerable to trafficking in Africa. Our embassies in Africa do not just report on trafficking. They aggressively engage with governments and civil society, lobbying for anti-trafficking laws to be passed, for governments to prosecute traffickers, and for the protection of victims of trafficking, especially child victims. Protection is a critical component of the United States 3P strategy for fighting trafficking in persons, the 3 Ps being prosecution, protection, and prevention. Both the Africa Bureau and the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons fund victim assistance programs that are designed specifically to respond to the comprehensive needs of child victims of trafficking. Beneficiaries are provided with safe and secure shelter, medical, paralegal, psychosocial counseling, and educational support. Furthermore, continuity of care is provided through ongoing case management and economic reintegration assistance to reduce the risk of re-trafficking. One of the pillars of the U.S. Action Plan for Children in Adversity is strengthening families. When efforts to keep families together fail, domestic and international adoption may be one way to help children who have lost parents. Orphans constitute a large, vulnerable population in Africa, and it is important for us to ensure that they are adopted in an ethical and transparent manner in accordance with international norms. That is why we work with our Bureau of Consular Affairs to encourage countries to join and implement the Hague Adoption Convention to further ethical and transparent inter-country adoptions. Moreover, we have encouraged countries to align their child welfare systems and adoption practices with convention standards. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, through a range of activities, the Department of State works to support education, security, social and child welfare systems, to provide humanitarian assistance, and to develop capacity for governance, rule of law, and the protection and advancement of human rights across the globe. There are so many ways for us to help children in Africa, and it is important for us to work collaboratively to address the issue with a survivor-centered approach, pressing countries for laws to protect them, supporting efforts to implement those laws, and establishing protective services in conjunction with civil society. We look forward to continuing to work with our U.S. government colleagues and with this subcommittee to address this important issue. I'd be pleased to take your questions, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jackson. Let me just ask both of you, what is your time limitations? Again, we thought we would be in late last night, and then they unexpectedly ended the session, and now we have votes until about 3:45 p.m. What is your availability? Because I'll ask some questions and risk missing the first vote if... and while you're doing that, I'll just ask the first question. Ms. Limborg, you mentioned, and I thank you for your work on the first 1,000 days of life from the moment of conception to the second birthday. As you may or may not know, I have worked on child survival since my first term in 1982. I got elected in 1980, and have worked on it ever since, every year offering amendments to increase vitamins, increase especially the issue of immunizations and oral rehydration therapy for those suffering diarrheal disease and all the rest. But we now know beyond any reasonable doubt those first 1,000 days of life are absolutely pivotal to a child, and I thank you for your work on that. My question is, compared to other children in Africa, are the orphans disproportionately left out of programs that include the first 1,000 days of life, which would mean that they will be healthier, have better immune system, or at least immunity capabilities, or are there very special efforts made to include them? Secondly, you spoke about the failure to thrive. I remember being in Nicholas Ceausescu's orphanages right after his fall in Romania, after being there many years, and all of a sudden we found 50, 60 kids lined up, one nurse or helper, and those kids were dying because they weren't even being picked up. And I'm wondering if you could just maybe spend some time on the importance of this failure to thrive. I don't think enough people understand that. And Mr. Ambassador, my first question to you would be, the DR Congo, what is the glitch there? What is the administration do to try to reverse it? And how quickly can we expect any results? Do we think we'll have results soon, especially for the families that are waiting so desperately to get their children and to begin bringing them home?
Thank you. On the efforts to include orphan and vulnerable children, there has been, fortunately, an important focus through the efforts of this Action Plan for Children in Adversity to make a special effort to reach out for orphans and vulnerable children. One of the challenges that we have, especially in conflict settings, is we don't always know where they all are or how many there are. So one of the things that we've been doing is working with partners to improve our understanding of what is the pool of need, how to get a better understanding of who's not being included in the program. So that's an important ongoing development. We also have a greater ability to target those who are orphans as a result of HIV/AIDS than those who are orphans through other conflict or other means, simply because of the way that the funding is structured. Finally, on the failure to thrive issue, I mean, this is really heartbreaking, and it is led us to really work hard on the second objective of trying to deinstitutionalize children and get them into more nurturing environments. And there have been some very important successes on this. Like, for example, in Ethiopia, we've worked with the government. They did a review of all of their institutions, about 100 institutions, and they found that 45 of them were simply substandard. They closed them, and with USAID's support, we worked to get those kids back into their families in some instances, reunited, or with foster care or other places where they could get better care. This is probably one of the areas where we need to spend the greatest additional focus. We're very determined to increase our ability to do this kind of programs, and the evidence is just overwhelming that you really got to take a whole-of-child approach. So even as we've increased substantially our ability to feed children more nutritious food more effectively in those early days and work with pregnant and lactating women, we really need to keep focusing our attention on this second bit, on the failure to thrive issue. And
How is your time?
families.
And I know you have busy schedules.
Well, I have a 4:30 that will, sorry, a 3:30 that will be very hard to change.
Okay, understand. How about you? You are? Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. If you could hold that then, and I could ask you one other question. I have a dozen, but we're out of time on the floor. I am the prime author of the Combating Autism Act. Started in 1997, it became law in 2000. Our reauthorization bill is pending over on the Senate side. One of the things that the IAC committee, headed up by NIH, found was that if women are getting folic acid 3 months before, and they're getting prenatal vitamins, in other words, even before they think they might become pregnant, that the impact on both mother and child is significantly enhanced, and it mitigates the possibility, it's not de facto, they haven't proven it, but they believe it does, of the issue of autism and a whole lot of other maladies that could occur. This is relatively new, and you know, we've had hearings. We have another one in about a week or so on autism globally here in our subcommittee. And the question is there an understanding that reproductive health ought to be inclusive? Very often it's seen as, you know, no babies. How does someone go about of not having a child, rather than how do we enhance the prospects of healthier mother and baby? And now this new component of, if you start earlier, reproductive health means that your child is less likely to get autism, and tens of millions of Africans have autism. And it's an epidemic that parallels HIV/AIDS, but largely unrecognized and unfocused upon. Your thoughts? And when you're done your comments, we'll stand in recess, and I'll have to read them. Right back.
So first of all, thank you for you know, your passion and commitment on these issues. The focus of the first 1,000 days is very much about reproductive health issues and ensuring that you have healthy mothers and healthy babies, both in tackling the issue of ending the preventable death of children under 5, and also ensuring that through better science, through better ability to have access to health care services, through better nutrition, that we are able to continue to make gains in this realm. So that's absolutely a strong focus through a whole variety of programs that we do that are focused on women who are in community situations, as well as those who are in conflict environments where it becomes more difficult to provide those services, but just as much of a priority.
Well, thank you. Perhaps if you could submit additional questions for the record to you, since I know you have to leave. If we could take a recess until 3:45, when votes will end, and Ambassador Jackson, if you are able to stay, but if not, we can also submit questions to you then, if that's
I would prefer, if my USAID colleague is leaving, that we take questions for the record.
Well, okay, and then if perhaps you could answer, if you don't mind right now, perhaps you could answer then the question that Chairman Smith posed to you, and then if we could take further questions for the record.
I would be happy to.
Thank you.
So in terms of DRC adoptions, they were suspended last September due to the DRC's government's concerns about fraud, corruption, and potential child buying, and their lack of capacity to manage the adoption program. We have been engaged continuously since then. We've met with ministers of Foreign Affairs, Interior, Gender, Family, and Children, and the Minister of Justice. On May 4th, Secretary Kerry met with President Kabila and made a personal plea for him to lift the suspension. Subsequent to that, we were able to secure exit permits for a small number of children. Dr. Biden, the Second Lady of the United States, was in Kinshasa earlier this month. She also made a plea for new exit permits to be issued. And this afternoon, some of my colleagues are meeting with the Congolese ambassador at the State Department. So my basic message is that we remain very engaged in attempting to secure exit permits for these children while supporting the Congolese efforts to strengthen their own internal controls to assure that children are being adopted by families who will give them loving, caring homes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We will then go into a relatively short recess until 3:45, when we'll reconvene with our second panel. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The subcommittee will resume its sitting, and I do want to welcome our distinguished witnesses and apologize profusely for that very long delay, which was attributable to votes. Like I said earlier, we thought last night that there were going to be a whole cluster last night. We would have been relatively free today. That didn't happen, so I do apologize. We're joined by Congressman Steve Stockman, who frankly just led a delegation to Abuja, to Nigeria, and is freshly returned, and thank him for his leadership on these issues. And I will now go to the introductions of our distinguished panelists. Is it in this one? Okay, thank you. Beginning first with Kelly Dempsey, who is the mother of 3 children, 2 of them adopted. She is an attorney practicing primarily in adoption law in her own firm in North Carolina. After overcoming her own struggle to bring home her daughter adopted from Vietnam, her legal practice expanded from civil litigation to focus on immigration issues with the international adoptions of children living abroad. Ms. Dempsey has represented hundreds of families in dozens of countries to ensure that the adoption process was completed and they were able to return home with their children. She also works to promote international adoption as a viable option for unparented children and to identify and implement solutions that enable more children to find permanent, loving homes. We'll then hear from Ms. Shimawe Muntemba, who is from Zambia and founded Zambia Orphans Aid in the United States. She was instrumental in the creation of St. Peter Claver Society for African Orphans at St. John's Catholic Church in Virginia. She worked at the World Bank on Africa-related issues such as microfinance, women's empowerment, and the environment and development balance. Indeed, it is because of her dedication to orphans affected by AIDS that she gave up her position at the World Bank to dedicate herself to this important cause. We'll then hear from Ms. Giovanna Jones, who is part of a military couple who are adopting a 5-year-old Congolese girl who is severely hearing impaired. Her adopted daughter is currently residing in a very poor orphanage, and while they are being billed for her medical expenses, she and her husband are unable to take her home with them. The prospects are limited for the Jones daughter if she is forced to stay in the DRC, and they are afraid for her life and well-being. And finally, we'll hear from Molumbet Jakol Hunegna, who is a Senior Director of the Save the Children's Global Monitoring and Evaluation and Knowledge Managing Unit. She is responsible for providing leadership for setting the vision and strategy of the monitoring and evaluation and knowledge management system of its international programs in more than 50 countries. She has more than 20 years of experience in international development and served as Director of Programs for the Africa region of Save the Children South Sudan program. She also worked as the USAID Mission Monitoring and Evaluation Advisor in Ethiopia. And without objection, your full resumes will be made a part of the record. And I thank you again for your patience and look forward to your testimony. If you could begin, Ms. Dempsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to thank you for the opportunity to appear today before this subcommittee and to talk about an important tool of protection for the orphan child in Africa. And that specific tool is international adoption. I've prepared a written statement. I also ask that that be entered into the record.
We made a part of the record?
I'm here on behalf of Both Ends Burning today, and we are a nonprofit advocacy organization dedicated to promoting and protecting every child's right to live in a permanent family. Family is the bedrock of our society. There's nothing more important in a child's life than his or her connection to their parents. When that connection is threatened, we need our foreign policies to help strengthen it. When it is severed, it should be repaired. And when it can't be repaired, we should help form a new connection, and that connection should be formed through international or domestic adoption when possible. This is the central role, I think, of child protection and child welfare that is missing today in our foreign policies. Far too often, we relegate adoption to a simple immigration issue, and we are missing an opportunity to serve children well. Department of State, through the embassies in Addis Ababa and in Kinshasa, as well as the Office of Children's Issues, plays a key role in international adoptions. However, instead of aiding American families and advocating for orphan children, the Department of State has become an obstacle that must be overcome in order for children to come home to their families. Instead of engaging the foreign governments in partnerships that promote permanency for children, the Department of State instead institutes policies that slow or stop adoptions. Instead of engaging the American adoptive parents, their adoption agencies and advocate organizations such as Both Ends Burning, we are regarded as adversaries. This approach is damaging children, and we've seen it over and over again. I want to focus my remarks today on Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, because those are the countries with which I have the most experience. In Ethiopia, in 2010, we saw 2,500 children come home to the United States. It was an all-time high and is barely touching the need that exists in that country. What's happened since is a 60% decline. And part of that is because in 2010, when the growth was at an all-time high, the Department of State made the decision to try to close Ethiopia's to adoptions. Luckily, there was resistance, and a team was sent in from USCIS and the Department of State to investigate the problems that the Department of State believed existed in adoptions. And they reviewed more than 4,000 cases, all of the cases that had happened in the prior 2 years. And what that team found was that overwhelmingly, these adoptions were good, ethical adoptions. They found a cluster of factors when present that would warrant further investigation, and they found that cluster of factors to exist in about 5% of the cases. Everyone walked away believing that when those factors were present, adoptions would be looked at more closely to ensure ethical, transparent adoptions. And instead, what happened is the U.S. Embassy started putting files in a drawer. Instead of adjudicating cases, which is their mandate, they started putting files in a drawer, and what that meant for children is that they languished in an orphanage. They did not tell families. They did not tell USCIS. They did not tell the Ethiopian government authorities. They simply put files in a drawer. Time passed. Families banded together, as they often do. They reached out to members of Congress, because you all have become necessary players in the adoption process, and we are very grateful for the work you do. And what was discovered was that these cases weren't being adjudicated. Another team went over from USCIS, and they conducted a review of those cases. And in the end, all but one was approved. But what that cost families and children was anywhere from an extra 6 months to a year of their life, extraordinary financial expenses, and the emotional toll that cannot be repaid. And what's happened since then has been an astonishing chilling effect on international adoptions from Ethiopia. Again, a 60% decline since the high of 2,500 in 2010. Similarly, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we saw a period of growth. In 2010, there were 41 adoptions, and that number has slowly increased over the last few years. In 2013, unable to handle the influx of cases, several hundred, the Department of State again began seeking ways to slow or stop adoptions from the Democratic Republic of Congo. They implemented a policy of 100% mandatory field investigations, despite the fact that over 97% of all cases coming out of Democratic Republic of Congo had been approved. So that's a 3% denial. I would say doesn't justify the allocation of resources. And what they told families and what they told the Democratic Republic of Congo was that that would lengthen the adoption process, but it would ensure integrity, which we certainly all support. However, there was no increase in the allocation of resources, and instead there were unsubstantiated allegations of fraud. Shortly thereafter, the suspension that now exists went into place, and over 800 families became stuck in a process, and over 800 children became stuck in orphanages, unable to come home to their families. And what we saw immediately following the suspension was frankly not much. The Department of State, instead of becoming advocates for these families and their children, instead of sharing their experiences of 90% approvals, began to sit quietly and to encourage the families to do the same. More than 10 months passed, and still families are not getting answers to their questions. In April, recognizing the size of this crisis and the lack of response from the Department of State, Both Ends Burning became engaged in an advocacy campaign. And Congress became engaged in an advocacy campaign. And we have had tremendous support both from you and from the subcommittee and from the entire House, and we are very grateful for House Resolution 588 that was recently passed. It's not enough to bring these children home. And so the families, I'd like to acknowledge the ones that are here today, in addition to Ms. Jones, who will speak. We have families who are here. I also have affidavits from 6 of the families that I would like to be entered into the record as well.
Well, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And what we learned from their affidavits and from these families is that there has been a total lack of response, a total lack of urgency, and a total lack of meaningful engagement to resolve this crisis. We ask for urgency to move forward in this, and that we find a solution that allows these kids to come home before any more die. We are aware of 10 that have perished during the wait, and we believe that many more will. In fact, one of the affidavits is
Perished from what?
from waiting. I mean, they've dehydration, malaria, malnutrition, easily avoidable diseases when they could have been home in this country. We've had siblings separated, biological siblings separated due to errors at the embassy. One kid's home, one kid's stuck in Congo waiting for processing and the suspension to lift. Really astonishing and outrageous tragedies that could and should be avoided. And so what I think is of paramount importance and what Both Ends Burning is advocating for and asking for is a foreign policy solution that creates a tool by which permanency can become a central tenet of child welfare and child protection. When I listened to the speakers earlier today, I didn't hear that. And in fact, I didn't hear anybody talking about finding family solutions for kids when their own families and kinship care wasn't available. It shouldn't be relegated to a last place idea. It should be planned for and advocated for so that children are getting their most basic needs met. And today in the Department of State, through the Office of Children's Issues and Consular Affairs, it simply isn't happening. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so very much for that testimony, disturbing, extremely disturbing as it is, and we'll get to further questions when our other panelists are concluded, but I thank you for that. Ms. Temba.
Good afternoon. As the chair has said, yeah, it is on. It is on. Is it okay now? Yeah. Okay. I'm a Zambian citizen, as the chair has said, who has personally been touched by the orphan problematic, having lost 5 younger sisters and brothers leaving a total of 11 children, some as young as 3 and 5. The good thing is that my nieces and nephews have helped me appreciate the orphan phenomenon and inspired me to both focus on HIV and AIDS and social protection as part of my work, and to be proactive in seeking assistance to reach those orphans whose families cannot provide for them adequately. We've heard that there are 56 million orphans in Africa, but this is an official figure. In Africa, official numbers do not capture all orphans. Many deaths occur in rural areas, and these are not recorded. The definition of orphans has also distorted their numbers. For example, to UNAIDS, an orphan should have lost both parents and under 15 years of age. UNICEF's definition embraces children 0 to 17 years old who would have lost one or both parents. African governments have adopted this definition. With so many armed conflicts raging in Africa, some civil society institutions, and I tend to agree with them, are advocating the definition to include abandoned and alone children, and these are many in most of the countries in Central and Western Africa. On the causes, we can identify 5 major causes of orphanhood in Africa: armed and civil conflict, natural disasters, weak and unequal health systems, abject poverty, and HIV and AIDS. I've been asked to say a few words on HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS has hit Eastern and Southern Africa the hardest. 70% of Africa's 15.1 million orphans of AIDS are in the Eastern and Southern subregions, most of them in the Southern. But Southern Africa records the highest uptake of antiretroviral treatment in Africa. It leads in national governmental budgetary allocations to HIV and AIDS. Yet in 2012, more infections and AIDS-related deaths occurred in this sub-region. Orphan numbers have risen exponentially in the last 2 decades and are poised to grow over the next few years and decades. The question is, why is this? I suggest that interventions seem to focus disproportionately on treatment and away from prevention. The gender dimension of HIV and AIDS and its treatment and the generational unequal access to treatment are impacting negatively on AIDS management outcomes. As well, poverty is undermining the effectiveness of treatment among the majority poor in most of our countries. A look at the impact on orphans. Children are first hit emotionally, as we have heard. When AIDS is the cause of death, stigma affects younger children within their communities and at school. Children have lost education opportunities, either because caregiving families are too poor or are not near schools. Another impact has been that of abuse in hosting families. In such situations, girls are treated as indentured labor and/or sex objects. Emerging is the phenomenon of child-headed households, some heads as young as 7 years, but many around 10 and 11. Those heads who contract HIV are hardly on treatment. Response. I wish to focus on 2 groups: close or extended family members. Initially, these responded positively, but as orphan numbers grew alongside entrenching poverty, families became overwhelmed. Today, many extended families have difficulties taking on the responsibility, and this is why I'm very much touched by this, what is being tried in the way of adoptions. What was normal as per our cultures in Africa has become a burden to many. Second, within the international community, Africans in the diaspora have responded by mobilizing financial and technical support in countries where they live and work. I give 2 examples from the Washington area. In 2000, supported by former ambassadors and embassy staff into Zambia and other African countries, we formed Zambia Orphans of AIDS, now Zambia Orphans Aid. We now operate in the UK and are registered in Zambia. Through community-based organizations and community schools, we have reached over 10,000 orphans, a drop in the ocean perhaps. In 2004, St. John Catholic Church in McLean, Virginia, formed St. Peter Clever Society for African Orphans. Through 4 institutions in Kenya and Zambia, the society has assisted many orphans in Kenya and Zambia over the last 10 years, offering them the means for HIV testing, for being looked after by physiotherapists, and for general food and nutritional needs. In both cases, individual Americans have rallied in support of the orphans. But I must underline, though, that despite the goodwill and hard work, the demand outstrips the supply. What then, Mr. Chairman? The contributions from her and probably from her may offer some of what we have to look at. But I feel that there are other opportunities for a minimum humanitarian response. Number one, greater political will is needed at the national level on behalf of orphans. Number two, higher education funds are needed for orphans to include technical and entrepreneurial skills training, specifying a proportion for girls. Number three, cash and in-kind support to child-headed families need to be intensified, but, and I underline, for a specified time frame, after which alternative care options must have been identified and offered to the children. However, this support must be flexible enough to respond to the shifting orphan care priorities. I thank you for offering me the opportunity.
Mr. Mbowe, thank you so much for your testimony. Ms. Jones, if you would proceed.
Yes, thank you for having me here. We first saw our daughter, who we'll name Annalie when she arrives. We first saw Annalie in April 2013 on a special needs adoption website. We decided early on to adopt an older child internationally with a hearing impairment because we read many cases where deaf older children are often overlooked and grow up without a language or the ability to communicate. A few months ago, we were pleased to hear that Annalie's orphanage was within walking distance from a school, only to be disappointed that she was unable to attend and learn with other children because of her hearing impairment. The idea of being trapped inside your own mind, frustrated with the inability to express your thoughts and feelings, and ostracized from your friends is heartbreaking to even think about. My family and I are the solution, if just for Annalie. We are willing, able, and ready to bring this princess into our home to give her endless opportunities to love, communicate, share her dreams, fears, and excitement. I love to educate myself in what will be her first language, American Sign Language. Over the last several years, I've taken courses and volunteered at Gallaudet, the Deaf University just minutes from here. My family has participated in deaf events and attended deaf church services, anything we can do to immerse ourselves and increase our knowledge and skills in a deaf culture. We also attend adoption conferences and take prep classes for adoptive parents so that we are fully aware of the good, bad, and ugly for when Annalie comes home. Our children have been eagerly waiting, especially our biological daughter, for their sister to come home so they can have tea parties, show her dance moves, and sign bedtime stories. As a family, we enjoy signing during meal times, using caption whenever we watch TV, and having a weekly movie time where we watch an all-deaf, 30-minute educational kid show. We homeschool our children, and we have Annalie's school desk and preschool supplies ready for her when she comes home. I have read books about teaching deaf children and have an awesome support group of moms homeschooling their deaf children. My husband and we have been an active-duty Air Force family for over 15 years. For the last 3 years, we've made it our mission to prepare financially and logistically for this adoption. We sacrificed family vacations and held several fundraisers for this costly adoption. Our church was instrumental not only in giving, but also in emotional and spiritual support. Painstakingly, but gratefully, we've raised all the funds needed for the adoption. We've bought furniture and prepped and painted Annalee's room. As a military-trained technician, my husband has planned to upgrade and install strobe light smoke detectors, doorbell signals, and other home devices for the hearing impaired. The nearby military bases will also offer family support through classes and workshops, and with the natural diversity that the military brings, our Congolese American daughter would blend right into playgroups, sport teams, and homeschool groups. We are more than ready for Annalee's arrival. After years of studying, enduring financial burdens, not to mention the countless hours of reading, completing, and mailing reams of adoption forms. Indeed, my family has sacrificed much. We realize, though, that our hardship is well worth Annalee's education, her happiness, and her life. As adoptive parents, we've spent years preparing, and it's
Romania made it very clear that a prerequisite for ascension into the European Union was an end to intercountry adoption. And she construed all intercountry adoptions as a form of human trafficking. And I would note, parenthetically, as the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, the landmark law to combat human trafficking at home and abroad, I take a backseat to no one in my absolute abhorrence of human trafficking, and that is why the Hague Convention was formulated as a way of facilitating it. But I'm just wondering if your organization does look at adoption as a form of protection for children.
Thank you. Save the Children supports enabling families to care for children. We believe unnecessary separation of children from their families should be prevented. We promote appropriate and permanent family care for children. But we believe that intercountry adoption should be an option only when it follows the standards and regulations contained within the Hague Convention. Our primary focus is making sure that children are cared for in a family context, as much as possible in their family of origin, and intercountry adoption is taken up as only option when that is not available.
Mr. Stockman wanted to comment, and
Yeah.
Ms. Dempsey, I think you might want to,
Yeah, go ahead.
or no?
Well, Dempsey, I have actually a question for you, Ms. Dempsey. You're, and I get to ask this because it's asked of me, quite frankly, often, because we shipped medical supplies to DRC, and in fact, one of the most dangerous trips I think I ever took was from Brazzaville to Kinshasa on that little boat. And I'm wondering, what motivated you to get involved in this, and how often do you go to Africa, and how did you describe your personal experience?
I come to this work as an adoptive mom, and overcoming the obstacles I encountered in my own government to bring my daughter home from Vietnam is the reason I do this work. I came realizing that there was a deficit in advocacy for families, and I shifted my practice, frankly, and it's become my life's work to help bring orphan children into families when they need it. The DRC crisis started in September, and at both ends burning, we were monitoring it. And when it became obvious to us that the Department of State wasn't meaningfully engaged, and the way that it became obvious to us was that they couldn't even tell us how many people were impacted, how many children were impacted, how many sick kids were at risk. They couldn't give us basic information. We decided that we needed to step in and help the families become organized and advocates for themselves. So my interest is in helping these families. I come to this work from a very personal commitment to kids, but it's become my life's work. I haven't actually traveled to Africa. I hope to do that very soon. So most of our efforts have been focused on engaging members of Congress and the administration to help Department of State find its way to make this an urgent humanitarian crisis and find a solution to it.
Yes, I will.
We have with us today Whitney Wrights from the USCIS, who actually did the investigation of Ethiopia when there was allegations were made. She led the interagency delegation to Addis Ababa in early 2011. She reviewed many cases on site at the embassy and then analyzed a database of over 4,000 cases, and her findings, her team's finding, was 75% of the cases were clean and non-problematic, 25% had problems generally of a clerical nature, and just 5% presented factors that would warrant a closer investigation, which clearly indicated a far better, for the holdups and for the lack of responsiveness. And of course, and I would say on behalf of our subcommittee, we are very grateful for the work that you did on that, Ms. Reitz. But you say, Ms. Dempsey, in your testimony, again getting back to Kinshasa, that when the numbers exploded, explosive was the word that you used, from a handful to several hundred of adoptions in the DRC, that their inability to handle the casework led to mandatory field investigations for all cases. Was there other proximate causes? Were they genuinely concerned about other mitigating factors that might say there's a problem here, or was it just a matter of this slows the process?
Well, I wish they were here to answer that question.
Well, before you answer, we did invite the Office of Children's Issues to be here, and we've turned this hearing into part one of a two-part hearing process. We will invite Ambassador Susan Jacobs to be here. She has testified before my subcommittee on previous occasions, particularly as it relates to child abduction. And I would note parenthetically, I have a bill that's pending in the Senate right now that passed on December 11th in the House, which the department seemingly was against, but Secretary Curry changed that position, and now they're for it. On child abduction, another hat that the Office of Children's Issues handles. And it was all from what I learned in dealing with a case of David Goldman, whose child was abducted to Brazil 5 years later, and a whole lot of mistakes later, he finally got his son back. But so it incorporates all the lessons learned there, and I think we need to be moving even more aggressively forward on this issue of child abduction as well, so that we can get this right. So if you could maybe speak to that. You also testified that there was a lack of resourcing, and if you have any idea how much resources need to be deployed here, and any of you might want to speak to that. And you also brought up the issue of where the central authority should be housed. And that was a big issue in the year 2000 faced by Congress. Do we go to HHS or do we go to Department of State? I'm not sure that should be revisited. Maybe it should, but if you could speak to that as well.
Well, those are a lot of questions, and I'll try to do my best to answer them. Please let me know where I fail, because I certainly will. With respect to the Department of State's motives in implementing the 100% mandatory field investigations, it is my understanding that they deemed the growth itself to be problematic and nothing more than that. And that's a tried and true tactic that we've seen from the Department of State. Anytime a program experiences growth, what you and I would regard as a success for children is deemed a problem at the Department of State Office of Children's Issues and in the U.S. embassies. And they start to view every case with suspicion and mistrust and looking for bad actors and bad actions. And while we certainly want them to make sure that these cases are ethical, transparent, well done, that the kids are legitimately orphans in need of permanent families, we expect that of them. What we know is that they don't use the right tools to do that. And instead, what they're doing is slowing down a system and engaging with foreign governments and adoptive families in a way that is frankly offensive and ineffective. So I look forward to the second round of this, and I look forward to their questions on that specific issue. With respect to the Office of Children's Issues as our central authority, what I can say, based on the numbers and my personal and professional experience with them, is that they are failing children. They are failing children in need, and they are not advocating for permanent solutions for children. Part of that is that their mandate is too narrow, I believe. They are tasked with enforcing Hague, promoting Hague, and that becomes an inherent conflict of interest in non-Hague countries. And our Hague expectations are perhaps unrealistic in developing nations who simply lack the infrastructure and resources to integrate all that's necessary to become a partner under Hague. And so what I would suggest is that we engage them in collaboration and we help them build systems that work and serve children well, instead of pointing fingers and making accusations and allegations that are unsubstantiated. And that's what we're doing today. So I believe Children and Families First, a pending bill, does a very good job of addressing this solution. It removes the Office of Children's Issues from primary responsibility for child protection and child welfare, and it would create a new office to do that. Both Ends Burning fully supports it. We're a member of the working group, and we would like to see that legislation move forward as quickly as possible. I don't think that is the solution for the DRC kids today. I think that will take too long, and we can't make the fundamental change that is necessary. And so what we are looking for from Congress on the DRC crisis is immediate intervention at the highest levels and reaching out to DRC in the way that the Department of State has failed to do so.
Would anyone else like to address that? And in the case of Kinshasa, was there, in your opinion, Ms. Jones perhaps, was there how long before they informed you of the tardiness of this process? And you mentioned, Ms. Dempsey, the Department of State could and should have been actively involved from the moment of suspension went into effect to find a solution. When did they get involved? How many
Well, they
months lapsed?
announced it 2 days after it went into effect,
Right.
so they issued an alert. It wasn't until June that they asked families with sick kids to come forward and to provide medical records and to identify themselves. That's 9 months after the adoption crisis began. That's 10 children who perished in the meantime.
Right.
And that was only after Congress called on them to make that happen. It wasn't until May that they could provide anybody in Congress or otherwise with the number of families who were involved in this crisis. And so they claim to have been actively engaged from the start. I would suggest the results tell us otherwise. It wasn't until Congress issued a mandate and sent a letter to President Kabila that we saw the few kids that have come home. And while we celebrate every victory, and we are so grateful for the 21 children who have come home, there are hundreds more waiting, and we can't rest on that and consider ourselves victorious. We have a lot of work to do.
Steve? Oh, yes.
Go ahead.
Did you want to respond? Or? Ms. Mumtemba?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think I'm very interested in this subject, but I want to underline that for Africa, really, adoption is very, very much a new thing. And it's in its infancy. And in terms of addressing the problem of orphans as it is now, we can obviously bring that in, but there are so much more issues that we are struggling with at the moment that people are trying to deal with. For example, what she says there, there's so much push on let families look after their kids, not adoption, not orphanages, not this and that, and yet we are not helping these families. So I would like to know, what are we doing to strengthen this? As what I know and my research has shown me, the extended family system is on its seams now in Africa. It's really breaking down. So if we want these kids to be with families, to be in the family environment, we have to strengthen them. What are we going to do about that? Because adoption, unless you really, really push it, it's very, I adopted my sister's son, and it wasn't easy for me. In my culture, I would say mother, older mother. It wasn't easy for me to bring him here. So, it's not a solution that we can see in the next 10, 20, 30 years. But the breaking down of family systems is where I think we have to push for your help at the moment. What can you do to push African governments to help at that level?
None of us ever said that adoption was the only solution. It's just part of a comprehensive approach. I'll never forget 10 years ago, a decade ago, Greg Simpkins, who's our staff director on this subcommittee, and I were in Addis Ababa and went to an AIDS orphanage, and we had 5 kids on each arm as we walked through the place. Big smiles, just kids looking for a place to go, and we know that some of those kids were not adoptable because it was an economic and that the extended family could not care for these AIDS orphans. But it underscored to me, and it's an experience I'll never forget, the desperate need for affection and love, and a place, a stable home where they could grow up in, because they were and the people who ran it were obviously absolutely committed. It was faith-based. It was backed by USAID, but they were, there was only so much they could do. But it is just part of the solution. None of us are ever saying this is the panacea. But your point is well taken. Mr.
Yeah, Ms. Jones, can I ask you a question? Two things. You mentioned you take her to church, and are you from here locally, and which church is it?
No, my children, we have never met our adopted child.
In which country?
So she's from, from DRC, so she's
Yeah.
from Congo. So we've never met her before, but we're just preparing to have her here. So we do attend different services that, that have deaf children and deaf services.
Yeah, I have a deaf staffer on staff, but I'm wondering, when I was over there, and I guess, have you been, you obviously...
We've never been.
Okay. Well, I was wondering, I'm actually going to ask the committee on this, have any of you been to DRC? Because the problem there is just more than, there's a lot of problems there. It's very problematic in so many ways. It's the size of Western Europe. It's a very large country. And in the eastern half, there's a guerrilla warfare on and off for many years, and many people have been killed there. And the government seems to be thriving on bribes. When you leave, they ask for money. So it's inherently a challenging country, not just for adoptions, but even for travel. And I'm wondering if you could tell the committee or us what you think we could do to facilitate more pressure on the government, because I understand that the president actually will be here in about 2 weeks. So I will bring this topic up with him, but I also think he's probably meeting with the chairman. Are you meeting with the? Yeah, well, he's coming here in 2 weeks. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess my question to you is what message would you like us to carry to the president?
I would like to say that, that we, there are a lot of criteria that that adoptive parents have to go through. And we are going through each one, even if there's new things that are brought to us after we finished, 6 pages and 30 pages of, different forms, so we're doing all that we have to do. And so we just want to, I guess, have things in writing, to say, okay, well, these parents have done this. These kids, there should be no reason why these kids are waiting. So we need explanation on why we're waiting. I think one thing that we have to do, we have to pay for when the children come home, our agencies has to come out and do post-adoption and make sure that the kids are happy and we're taking care of them, and we're doing what we said we were doing. And so then I asked our agency, I said, well, if we have to do these things and we're paying for this service, why is it a question to the other country? And then she says to me, well, they never see the post-adoptions. That is only for the agencies, for the agency. So if there is any way that we can, or the president can make sure that all the post-adoptions that we're paying for, all the pictures and the questions that are being asked, if we're taking care of them, if they're happy, if they're thriving, can DRC, can they have that information? Is there any way that they can have that information? So that's not a question. So that's one less thing that we have to worry about.
Let me, if I could, Ms. Dempsey, you made a point that adoptions have declined 69% over the last 9 years, and that the Department of State has simply continued in its primary role as gatekeeper instead of building a base of child welfare and child protection expertise. We know that Russia obviously cut off adoptions in 2012, so including in that figure would be, we still had countries of origin that were willing to provide a means of adopting children. That number, if a cynical take on that would be that there might be a bias against adoption. What is your take on that? Is it a lack of Foreign Service officers having too many cases, On the child abduction case, parenthetically, and in a parallel fashion, in hearings that I held here with the Office of Children's Issues, my big question I would often ask is, what do you do with the files? What kind of action, advocacy do you take to make sure things actually happen, particularly when there's obstacles strewn in the path of an adopting parent, or in this case, an abducted child and the left behind parent? What do you do to really navigate that and make sure the country is facilitating it with their government authority, so that children are protected, but these delays, interminable delays, are overcome?
We have seen a tremendous decline in the number of adoptions. Part of that is attributable to the sending countries' unilateral decisions, as we saw in Russia. China has a concentrated effort to reduce the number of adoptions, and it was a large sending country. But we've also seen programs close for reasons that I've already discussed. Similar to what we see in Ethiopia and what we see in DRC, Nepal closed in 2010, and that was a decision made by the Department of State and USCIS. Absent a statutory mandate to do so, they suspended the processing of adoptions, closing the door to hundreds, if not thousands, of orphan children based on suspicion. I will tell you that that program closed under allegations that all the children were trafficked. All 56 cases in the pipeline at that time were investigated, and not a single one of them had been trafficked. Every single one of them was a legitimate orphan, and every single one of them now lives here in the United States. We are now approaching the 4th anniversary of the closure of that program, and it remains closed inexplicably. And so I would say that there is a bias against international adoption in the Department of State, and that child welfare and child permanency is not on the dance card of the Office of Children's Issues. Instead, they are focused on processing cases and doing so in a way that slows the process for families and children.
Anything else for the hearing? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, so when we gathered here to talk about the Africa orphan crisis, because it is a crisis because millions of children are in this state now. And I do personally agree, sincerely appreciate that inter-country adoption may be one option to address this issue. But in terms of looking at the magnitude of this crisis, Save the Children believes in looking at a systemic approach to this, focusing on families, and especially in Africa when kinship care is the system and the custom. Children are, we focus on what is in the best interest of the child, and how do we prepare these families who are already overstretched from meager resources to care for an additional child, an additional family member in their families. So I'd like to just highlight again those two focus areas where I have made in my earlier comment that resources, Congressman, you mentioned about what do we do, what kind of resources are needed. I think protecting the commitment is very much important. It's really important that that we do appreciate the commitment that's already made, but protecting that commitment and increasing those resources to help us support those families to protect the children is very important. And also looking at the holistic needs of those children because of the magnitude of the need that we have in Africa today.
Thank you. Ms. Jones, if I could ask you, first of all, thank you for your service to the Air Force and to this country. As you point out, 15 years, you're an Air Force family. You point out that my family and I are the solution, if just for Anna Lee. We are willing and able and ready to bring this princess into our home, to give her endless opportunities to love, communicate, share her dreams, fears, and excitement. And you talk about the hearing impairment and how you want to make the difference in her life to really help her with that. Has that impairment grown worse? If you could elaborate on that, because delay is often denial, and even though she's not as young as some others who are adopted, when it comes to a medical or any other condition, delay can mean further impairment that does not get turned around. So if you could just speak to that issue, and anyone else who would like to touch that. Again, the idea that if the care is not being provided and this home, your home is ready, willing, and able to provide it, that seems to be a huge setback for the child.
Yes, as I mentioned, you know, she is deaf, and the orphanage there has a school within walking distance, and these children are learning English, and they're learning basic skills just so that they can have some type of skill. And so for her, she doesn't have that option. We don't get updates of, you know, of how great she's doing. The only time we get an update is when we get invoiced when she is sick with malaria or she has a toothache that needs to be paid for. So that is the only updates that we get. Our agency let us know when we bring her home, she will be on the developmentally level of an 18-month-old. Even though she's 5 on paper, we believe she's about 7. But I want to say there's no hope for her. She understands how to walk, talk, and walk, use the bathroom, and gesture of what she wants, but cannot fully communicate. We send picture books over, and we have pictures of her looking at our family book and videos, but she has no clue. When she waves, she repeats what she sees, and she would wave the whole video until someone takes her hand and put it down, and she just has this look of, I don't know what's going on, you know? So she needs to be home so that she can begin to express herself and let us know what her needs, her wants are, and she's just not getting that there.
Yes.
I would just like to add, with respect to the children who are ill and life-altering conditions, life-threatening conditions, the DGM recently announced last week that they would not consider the medically fragile cases anymore, and the Department of State's response to these families was, too bad, you just need to sit and wait until the suspension is lifted, and I would expect more urgency from them. On behalf of these children and behalf of these families, I would expect them to say, we're going to be doing everything in our power to change or reverse this decision so that more children don't die. I know I don't need to remind you, but I want to say again for the record that children are dying during this wait. Children who have families here ready to provide for them are perishing needlessly, and we need our government to act with a sense of urgency.
Your point has been very well taken. And you said you have knowledge of at least 10
Yes.
who have passed away for whom that would have not been the case.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming out, and I appreciate it, and it's opened my eyes. But anybody that's working with the DRC on any level, including humanitarian aid, it's a challenge. And I think the chairman and I will be dedicated to making sure that this hopefully will be resolved. Thank you.
Yeah. Just one question, Ms. Dempsey, you might be able to answer. What part of the Department of State addresses international child welfare and protection?
I'm not aware of any part of the Department of State that addresses child welfare and child protection, which I think is a fundamental flaw.
You said you talked to Department of State. Do you want to tell us after the hearing who that was, or?
I'll tell you in the hearing.
Okay.
I'm talking to the Office of Children's Issues. The primary communications are coming from Sarah Schaefer, who runs the desk officer. She's simply the messenger. But it's coming from the Office of Children's Issues and the embassy in Kinshasa.
The embassy, okay, thank you.
Anything you'd like to add before we conclude the hearing? And perhaps in that, if you would like to, if Susan Jacobs was sitting here rather than down at her office, what would you say? And again, we will convey your testimonies to them in the spirit of encouragement and part admonishment. But if there's anything you would like to say before we close?
I would just like to thank you sincerely and for the opportunity to appear today and to share this information with you all, and for all that you've done already for the children in need and all that you are committing to do going forward. The crisis can't be solved today, but it needs to be solved, and we need to be working towards that. With respect to Ambassador Jacobs, I welcome the opportunity to sit with her and to discuss these issues with her and to help the Department of State do their job better. I've been rebuffed in my personal...
Did you say rebuffed?
Yes. When I've offered to share my learnings and findings And so I would ask, what I would like to know from the Department of State is why they're doing 100% field investigations, what number of cases are finding fraud. My guess is it's a very small number, what amount of resources they need to be more effective in doing their job, and why they're not advocating with a sense of urgency on behalf of these families. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies?
I also want to thank for this opportunity, and I would like to say that Save the Children would be happy to be a partner with the subcommittee or your staff to have dialogue on this issue. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
And I would like to thank you, too, for the opportunity to be the voice of not only for my child, but for the other adoptive moms and dads and parents out there that are ready to bring their children home.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. And I look forward to continued discussions and broadened help for African orphans of AIDS, and especially, and for children in conflict areas. And one of these days, I would like to really say, how are you going to help us beyond adoption? Because really the need is great out there.
No, I hear you.
And maybe as Congress people, you can help push for that help to come from the USAIDs and national country offices, and maybe we can get more help that way.
That point is well taken. In the larger scope of the hearing today, again, we would have loved to have had the Office of Children's Issues here, and we will make that request again. But Nancy Limborg, who is a very competent, very effective person with whom I personally and this subcommittee in toto have had very good working relationship with, she is very committed, as is her staff, on that larger issue that you mentioned, and which is why I opened up with the first 1,000 days of life as being absolutely transformative for the next 30,000 days of that child into adulthood, individual person. And if it doesn't start in the womb, it doesn't. I mean, even the susceptibility to malaria and a host of other, the immune system is far less efficacious in fighting off diseases than if you start while it's still he or she or unborn children. And that needs to grow exponentially in Africa, in Latin America, elsewhere, Asia, and in this country as well. So I'd like to thank, Steve, if you have any further comments, or are we?
We just have a great chairman, that's all. It's unanimous.
Well, we will follow this up with a part 2, and we will invite Ambassador Jacobs or her designee, but I do hope she'll come, and especially to hear testimonies the likes of which we heard today, but we will give her your testimonies as well. So thank you, and the hearing is adjourned.